Hello, everyone. My name's Armin.
And I'm Tara.
And the article we are covering in this video is a second look, Tadao Ando's Church of Light in Ibaraki. It's written by Christian Shittik and Kiko Arima. Here's the agenda for what we'll be covering throughout our presentation.
So let's talk about the publisher and the authors first. Detail magazine is published 12 times a year since 2009. Before that, it was only 10 times a year in English and German. This particular issue, titled Solid Forms of Construction, was released in November of 2011, which that year was the 50th anniversary of the magazine. And as you've noticed, the article is called A Second Look because in March of 1991, they did their first article on the same topic. The magazine is the International Professional Journal for Architecture and Construction. Now let's talk about the authors. Christian Skitich is one of the main editors at Detail since 1991. He's also an author and publisher under his direction, Detail developed to become international. And Kiko Arima has been the editor for Detail Japan for a number of years until becoming active as an independent publicist and curator in Tokyo in 2008.
Here's some key terms from the article that it's important to get familiar with. The first is European modernism. Now, although we're familiar with the term, European modernism rejects decorative additions and invites minimalism. This is important because the architect we're covering, Tadao Ando, was a world traveler, especially in his early days of being on the prowl for new architecture and design. A lot of his exposure came in Europe. Postmodernism was in the midst of being replaced by deconstructivism during Ando's rise. Deconstructivism, which started taking form in the 1980s, was replacing postmodernism, but Tadao Ando didn't follow either or admire either of the art movements, and he kind of set on his own path. That path included brutalism a lot of times because brutalism was characterized by deliberate plainness or crudity, which Ando's exposed concrete a lot of times gave that feeling. Concrete, we know what it is, but it's crucial to fully wrap our head around it because it was Ando's primary ingredient, and he took the primitive cement, gravel, and water to make beautiful, meaningful buildings. Asceticism was really important to Ando because it refers to having that strict self-discipline and avoiding indulgence, really falling in line with minimalism. Bubble economy is important as well because that's what was going on in Japan at the time the Church of Light was built, which we'll get into shortly. Japan's economic interests ruled the value system of the society at the time, and Ando offered a refuge from all of that outside world.
Now, who is Tadao Ando? He was born in 1941 in Osaka, Japan. At first, he was a boxer. Then he was turned into a truck driver. And then he started working in a wooden workshop for his grandmother. And he became interested in architecture and decided to travel the world to learn more about the art. But as this quote explains, Ando paid so much attention to detail and is a very, very detail-oriented architect. As the quote says, he invested significant energy on the invisible details required to create appealing surfaces in all of his work.
So the majestic Church of Light. It was finished in 1989 and started being built in the early 1980s. It was built in Ibakara, Japan, which is a small city between Osaka and Kyoto. The Church of Light really catapulted Tadao Ando to international stardom. The cross that's radiated by the natural light and mixed or combined with the exposed concrete all around it really are both testament to Ando's belief system and a lot of his preparation in his buildings. A Sunday school was later added beside the chapel as well, complementing its design characteristics.
So throughout his career, Ando usually focused on smaller buildings that could actually communicate his form of work to the audience. But later in his career, he was approached to do larger and often commercial projects that he had to make sure didn't lose the power of expression because he paid so much attention to detail in his smaller work. And this was a problem that he faced throughout his career, but um, the many museums that he has already indicated repetition of forms where geometrics gain a life of their own, and in some cases, the original qualities of his work are reserved. So let's now talk about brutalism and Japanese traditional art, which is what Ando usually focused on. So as we all know, brutalist architecture emerged during the 1950s in the United Kingdom, but the word brutalism doesn't come from its harsh aesthetic. It's actually a direct translation for the French for raw concrete. It consists of exposed unpainted building materials such as steel and concrete with angular geometric shapes and usually has a monochrome color palette. Now, Japanese traditional art focuses on wooden structures that are elevated with tiled roofs, and one important factor of it is the sliding doors, which we're going to talk more about. So how did Ando combine the two? Well, regarding the sliding doors, he references them that are in the traditional Japanese tea house with the precision and the grids that form the Church of the Light, like the walls around it. And the light that is reflected by the walls highlight the anchor bolt holes, and also his attention to detail that I mentioned before all come together to match the sophistication of traditional Japanese architecture, which is also explained by the quote below. Now, the use of wood, as I mentioned, is important in Japanese architecture, and the exposed concrete progressed gradually in harmony with modern architecture and has many forms of expression. In the Church of the Light, Ando incorporates the historic Japanese architecture by referencing formwork methods such as yuki-zukuri, where formwork receives carvings that accentuate the structure of wood, or the Mukuita Hanzan formwork made of solid boards of Japanese cedar or pine. Now let's talk about our theoretical perspective of critical regionalism. This theory promotes local or national culture within architecture. It's a progressive approach that it aims to combine the global and local languages of architecture. It also contradicts the placelessness and lack of identity in international architecture, but also rejects the individualism of postmodern architecture. So, how can we apply this to Ando? He reconnected Japanese architecture with nature, a relationship he thought has been lost with the emergence of modernist architecture. As explained by the quote, he achieved adapting to the principles Japanese tradition to the present principles, not formal characteristics. This applies to the way he deals with light, shadow, and space, to the relation between houses and nature, or to turning the passing of seasons into a perceivable phenomenon, equally important to Ando as tradition itself.
So when we talk about some connections to other readings from our class, the first one is with Frank Lloyd Wright and the myth of the prairie, 1890 to 1916. Wright says that he's influenced by Japanese architecture way back in 1890. It just goes to show the far-reaching and historical impact that Japanese architecture has had before Tadao Ando and this article ever surfaced. Now, despite the influence, there was a very contrasting goal that Wright had, and that was to incorporate the total environment that he made with his buildings, including a church called the Unity Temple. So his goal was to kind of make it feel like everyone was connected, all institutional buildings and people and nature, all of that was one, where Ando, on the flip side, really tried to separate the exterior world from the Church of Light. Next, learning from architecture and conflict. It shows in that article, and it says that societal issues have had influence on architectural design and limitations. And that really works with Tadao Ando's Church of Light because he created a space of solace for what he may have not agreed on going out on the outside, providing a place of refuge or alternative to a turbulent environment. Now let's look at some specific examples in architecture that relate to our article. First is the Salk Institute, which was completed in 1965. There's multiple reasons why this institute correlates so nicely with Tadao Ando and our article. The first and most important reason is probably because it incorporates the same design principle that uses the anchor bolt holes that are precisely modeled down to the millimeter. Louis Kahn was the only other person, or at least well-known architect, that was using that method before Tadao Ando. The second reason is the relation with natural light. So the Salk Institute actually has 40-foot long wells that are 25 feet wide on both sides of the building to bring daylight into the lowest levels of the building. Next is the Maison de la Culture by Le Corbusier. The Swiss-born French architect was actually Tadao Ando's hero, and he was one of the main reasons why Tadao Ando had an unbiased relationship to concrete. He looked up to Le Corbusier, and he had similar values in aestheticism and brutalism as well. Last is the Sagamine House, built in Nagakute, Japan, and finished in 2016, years after Tadao Ando's peak of his stardom. But I thought it was interesting because it's possible that the architect for this house, Tomaki Uno, was a pupil or an inspiring architect that looked up to Tadao Ando, because we could assume he's one of Ando's admirers because of his age, 20 years younger. And the silky appearance of this house really gives that imitation feel of what Tadao Ando strived to get from his viewers and his visitors.
Now let's talk about exclusion and brutalism. Well, brutalist architects are primarily white and male, and the diversity of the communities that house brutalist architecture is not taken into account usually. As we know, brutalist architecture was developed to house as many as people as possible in as less space as possible. So by doing that and being so simple, the style suggests a soulless and cultureless approach to architecture. As explained by the code, it represents an artifact of European philosophical totalitarianism, which is cold-hearted, inhumane, hideous, and monstrous. The rise of the modern movement in architecture, which brutalism is part, was inspired and motivated by the rise of the industry and not having people's cultures in mind. So it's criticized as being unfriendly and uncommunicative instead of being integrative and protective as it was intended to do so. It also disregards the social, cultural, and architectural value of its surroundings. Here are two female brutalist architects that I think you should definitely check out. Now let's talk about inclusion. At the time that Ando was asked to design the Church of the Light, only about 1% of the Japanese population were practicing Christians, and churches were usually a place for Western-style weddings, and they weren't a place of worship. So the pastor, Noboru Karakume, had requested a house of worship with a connection to the earth situated along the road where the community could congregate. And at the time, there were so many trends in architecture, but regardless of such trends, Ando employs concrete as an even surface and draws from the precise skills of indigenous craftsmen.
This brings us to our end of our presentation. Tara and I would like to thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we want to leave you with this one question that you can maybe answer in your discussion post. Who was Tadao Ando's hero? And we'll leave you with that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.